The husband and his family discover they won't receive the inheritance and abandon the woman with a terminal illness, but they are shocked when they return for her funeral. Dear viewers, welcome to our channel. Subscribe to receive more stories every day. Elizabeth had always been a woman of quiet grace. She'd navigated her life with a strength that others often mistook for passivity. She had a way of listening that made people feel she saw straight into their souls, a gift that had kept her heart open, even in the face of the selfishness she saw in others. When Robert entered her life, he was captivated by her steady gaze and calm demeanor. He saw in her the stability he craved, the sense of peace he thought would be his salvation from a world obsessed with status and wealth. But as the years passed, Robert's family began to weave their influence over him, questioning Elizabeth's value and reminding him that he could be more. They'd scoffed at her simplicity, pressing Robert to realize that he could be with someone who would bring more than kindness into his life. Elizabeth became the target of their disdain, enduring thinly veiled insults and watching as Robert grew colder under their influence. Yet, she endured it all in silence, her heart still anchored to the love she believed in. Everything changed the day Elizabeth received her diagnosis. A rare, aggressive illness had taken root, and the doctors told her she had less than a year. The news shook her, but she kept it to herself, unwilling to burden Robert and his family with the truth. She'd long known they saw her as nothing more than a weight on their lives. But she hoped, against all odds, that her quiet departure would leave Robert with a sense of regret, maybe even a spark of the man he'd been when he first loved her. Elizabeth's will was a simple affair, so she thought. She left everything she had to Robert, believing he would cherish it as a piece of her legacy. But then, in her final months, Elizabeth met a woman named Annabel, a neighbor who had recently lost her husband and was struggling to raise 2 young children. They formed a fast friendship, and Annabel became her confidant, someone who listened without judgment. One evening, while sitting together over tea, Elizabeth confessed her plans, and Annabel's response changed everything. "Elizabeth, are you sure this is the legacy you want to leave?" Annabel asked gently. "Are you sure you want your love to be a gift to someone who has forgotten how to love you?" The question lingered with Elizabeth long after Annabel left. That night she made a decision. She would rewrite her will, but she would keep the change hidden, a last testament to the love and respect she once believed in. She crafted the will with precision, leaving Robert with nothing but a letter. A single letter to be read upon her death. And if he and his family dared to show up at her funeral, they would find that letter waiting, revealing the truth she had kept from them. In the months that followed, Elizabeth's illness took its toll. Her body grew frail, her spirit clinging to each day with a bittersweet anticipation. She endured alone, her once vibrant spirit dimming in isolation. Annabel stayed close, providing what comfort she could, but the rest of Elizabeth's world grew colder. It was only a few weeks before her passing that Robert and his family discovered Elizabeth had rewritten the will. When Robert confronted her, she was too weak to argue, but the heartbreak in her eyes was unmistakable. "You're not leaving me anything," he spat, unable to mask his anger. "After all these years." Elizabeth's voice was barely a whisper, but her words were clear. "I left you exactly what you deserve, Robert. I hope someday you understand why." The family abandoned her that very night. Elizabeth knew she would face her final days alone, but she accepted it with quiet dignity, her heart steady in its decision. And as her days dwindled, she found peace in the knowledge that her last act would be a reflection of the love she believed in, love that was unconditional but never blind. When the day of her funeral arrived, Robert and his family returned, more out of duty than genuine grief. They gathered in the small church, where Elizabeth's coffin lay surrounded by simple white lilies, the only flowers she'd ever favored. Her lawyer, an older man with kind eyes, stood waiting at the back of the church, clutching a small envelope. As the final eulogies were given, the lawyer stepped forward, clearing his throat. "Elizabeth left something behind," he announced, his voice echoing through the quiet space. Robert shifted uncomfortably, casting a glance at his family, who all seemed equally puzzled. In the silence that followed, the lawyer handed Robert the envelope, his expression unreadable. Robert tore it open, pulling out a letter in Elizabeth's familiar handwriting. His hands shook as he began to read. "Robert, if you're reading this, then I have gone as quietly as I lived, though not without a final word. You may wonder why I left you with nothing, but I assure you it was not out of malice. I left you with something far more valuable than money, a mirror to see yourself as I saw you in my final days. You were my first love, Robert, and in some small part, I suppose you'll be my last. But love is not without its limits. I hope you can find peace in knowing that I loved you once with all I had. I am leaving the inheritance to those who stood by me with compassion, and to people who may never know me, but who will feel my kindness through the help it offers them. Goodbye, Robert. May you find in your reflection the strength to forgive yourself. With love, Elizabeth." Robert's face went pale as he read, the full weight of her words settling over him. Around him, his family exchanged worried glances, their expressions shifting from confusion to horror as the realization dawned on them all. Elizabeth had left her fortune to strangers, to anyone but them. The echoes of her words seemed to fill the church, a quiet condemnation of the lives they had lived. And for the first time, Robert felt the sting of his own choices, a pain sharper than any loss he had ever known. The silence in the church stretched long and heavy as Robert finished reading Elizabeth's letter. The finality of her words hung in the air like a weight, pressing down on everyone present. His family exchanged glances, confusion giving way to a simmering anger. They had come to this funeral with little more than a faint sense of obligation, expecting it would bring closure to their lives and release them from any remaining connection to Elizabeth. Instead, they found themselves trapped, haunted by her final words. The lawyer cleared his throat, interrupting the uncomfortable silence. "There's more," he said, his voice steady yet carrying a hint of sympathy. "Elizabeth made detailed arrangements regarding her estate. She asked that these arrangements be made known to each of you after her passing." He retrieved a second envelope, this one addressed to Robert's sister, Catherine, who had always harbored a particular dislike for Elizabeth. Catherine took it reluctantly, her face contorting as she opened the letter, skimming through its contents. Her eyes widened in shock. "What is this?" she demanded, her voice shrill. "She gave her inheritance to strangers, to some foundation." She looked up at the lawyer, unable to contain her anger. Why would she do this? The lawyer met her gaze calmly. Elizabeth's wishes were clear. She established a foundation for people abandoned by those they trusted. In her words, for every person left behind to face life alone, for everyone who lost support when they needed it most. She wanted to ensure that her legacy would reach those who might never have had a helping hand otherwise. Robert's other family members began muttering among themselves, disbelieving, furious, and above all resentful. They had assumed Elizabeth's estate would be their reward, a final benefit from her years of loyalty. Now, the foundation she had established would use her wealth to aid strangers. It was an outcome they could scarcely accept. But Robert, who had held Elizabeth's letter close, remained silent. Her words had struck him with a force he hadn't anticipated. Each line felt like a carefully crafted reminder of the man he once was, the man who had loved her deeply before ambition and family influence had eroded his kindness. She had left him with something intangible yet profound, a mirror to see the truth of himself. And though he'd never admit it, he felt the sting of her loss more acutely than he ever thought possible. After the funeral, the family gathered at Robert's home, each of them tense and simmering with resentment. They debated the legality of Elizabeth's actions, considering ways to challenge her will, though deep down, they knew she had been thorough in her preparations. Catherine was particularly vocal, declaring it was unfair and cruel that Elizabeth had betrayed them. "You call this love?" Catherine sneered, tossing Elizabeth's letter onto the table. "This is vindictive. This is her revenge on us all." But Robert, despite his own lingering resentment, knew better. Elizabeth hadn't written that letter out of malice. He could feel it in the careful choice of her words, the subtle way she had tried to make him understand her final act. It was something else entirely. And the realization gnawed at him, quietly breaking through his defensive anger. As the days passed, Robert found himself unable to let go of the letter. He read it over and over, searching for some hint, some detail he might have missed. Each time he read it, her words seemed to echo with a depth he hadn't expected. He began to remember the early days of their marriage, the simple moments they'd shared, the way she had loved him without question. One evening, as he sat alone, a deep restlessness took hold of him. Elizabeth's voice seemed to linger in his mind, urging him to see her life through her eyes. He decided, almost on impulse, to visit the foundation she had established. He wanted to see for himself what Elizabeth had chosen to leave behind, a legacy not of wealth, but of compassion. The foundation was housed in a modest building on the outskirts of town. As Robert approached, he was surprised to see a line of people waiting outside. Mothers with children, elderly couples, young men and women with expressions of quiet resilience. They were there for assistance, for hope. And as he watched them, a strange feeling settled over him. Something he hadn't felt in years: humility. Inside, he introduced himself to the director, a kind-faced woman who recognized his name instantly. She invited him to her office, and as they spoke, she revealed the scope of Elizabeth's vision. Through her foundation, Elizabeth had created scholarships, funded shelters, and provided medical support for those facing terminal illnesses without family support. Every dollar of her estate was set to benefit others in a way that was deeply personal to her own journey. The director, sensing Robert's unspoken regret, handed him a letter. "Elizabeth wrote this for you," she said softly. "She asked that you receive it only if you came here in person." With trembling hands, Robert opened the letter, bracing himself for what he might find. "Robert, I hope this letter finds you with an open heart. By now, you've seen what I chose to leave behind. I know it may feel like I turned my back on you and your family, but please understand. I gave you something more precious than money. For every moment I spent alone, for every tear I shed in silence, I found the strength to turn that pain into something meaningful. I wanted to ensure that my legacy would touch the lives of those who had no one to stand beside them. I hope, in seeing this, you'll understand the gift I've given you, the chance to remember who we once were. I forgive you, Robert. I hope, in time, you'll forgive yourself too. With all my heart, Elizabeth." Robert's hands shook as he read her words. The bitterness he'd clung to began to crumble, replaced by a sense of profound loss, not just for Elizabeth, but for the man he'd become. Her forgiveness was a gift he felt he didn't deserve, yet it was the only balm that could ease the guilt he now carried. The drive home was a blur. Robert's mind reeled, his thoughts colliding with memories of Elizabeth, of the love he'd once shared with her and then let slip away. Her legacy was no longer just a foundation or a will. It was a reminder of the person he had failed to be. That evening, as he sat alone in his quiet home, he realized Elizabeth's inheritance was more than money or material comfort. She had left him with the truth, with a lesson he could never escape. And though the weight of it felt crushing, he knew it was the only way forward. His family, however, was less accepting. Catherine and the others continued to pursue legal means to contest Elizabeth's will, driven by their own pride and greed. But Robert, for the first time, found himself uninterested in their schemes. The desire for wealth, the need for status, they all felt empty now, hollow remnants of a life he no longer wanted. The foundation became a place he visited often, volunteering in the quiet hours of the evening, offering what little he could to honor Elizabeth's memory. And in those moments, surrounded by strangers, he began to heal, finding in them the compassion he'd once taken for granted. As the weeks passed, Robert's family grew increasingly frustrated and bitter. Despite consulting multiple lawyers, it became clear that Elizabeth's will was airtight. Every detail had been meticulously planned, every clause legally sound. Her assets, her investments, even her personal belongings, all were irrevocably transferred to the foundation she had established. No legal argument, however persuasive, could undo the finality of her decision. Catherine was the most vocal about their loss, her anger festering with each passing day. She railed against Elizabeth's cruelty, calling it an act of betrayal. "She must have done this just to spite us," she would say, her voice dripping with resentment. The rest of the family echoed her sentiments, unwilling to accept that they had been cut off. To them, Elizabeth's actions were a calculated blow, an unforgivable betrayal of their right to the wealth they had long assumed would be theirs. But Robert had grown distant from their complaints. In his mind, Elizabeth's letter had transformed his perspective, turning his focus inward, away from the blame his family so readily projected. Her words had opened a path toward redemption, a chance to become someone worthy of the love she'd once had for him. And while his family continued to plot and scheme, Robert found himself spending more time at the foundation. Each evening, he volunteered in small ways, assisting with donations, organizing supplies, and talking to those who came seeking help. At first, he kept to himself, a quiet observer. But as time went on, he began to speak with the people Elizabeth's foundation served. The single mothers, the elderly, the young men and women struggling to find their way. They shared stories of hardship, resilience, and hope, and he listened, each story etching itself into his heart. One evening, as he was cleaning up after a particularly busy day, he met Annabel, the friend Elizabeth had mentioned in her first letter. She was a warm, empathetic woman with a ready smile and a quiet strength that reminded him of Elizabeth. Annabel greeted him with a mix of surprise and understanding. "So you're Robert," she said, her voice kind but firm. "Elizabeth spoke of you often. She wanted you to see what she built here." Robert nodded, feeling a twinge of shame. "I didn't understand her when she was alive," he admitted. "I didn't understand the value of what she was doing, or what she saw in people." Annabel placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. Elizabeth's kindness touched everyone she met. She believed in helping others, no matter what she faced in her own life. Her heart was always open, even when others turned their backs on her. They sat in quiet reflection, and for the first time, Robert felt the full weight of what he'd lost. Elizabeth had given him love without condition, forgiveness without expectation. She had built a legacy of compassion, something that would live on far beyond her own life. And now, in this place she'd created, he saw the echoes of her love reflected in every face he encountered. Meanwhile, Robert's family grew increasingly desperate. Catherine, unwilling to let go of her anger, pushed her siblings to take further action, to do whatever it took to reclaim what they believed was rightfully theirs. She even attempted to tarnish Elizabeth's memory, spreading rumors and falsehoods to anyone who would listen. But her words fell flat, for Elizabeth's foundation had already earned a reputation in the community as a beacon of kindness and support. Eventually, Catherine and the rest of the family reached a breaking point. Their scheming, their plotting, it all amounted to nothing, leaving them bitter and isolated, prisoners of their own greed. In their relentless pursuit of wealth, they had overlooked the one thing that could have brought them true peace: forgiveness. Robert watched as his family unraveled, their once close ties fraying under the weight of their resentment. He knew that, in some small way, he had been a part of this toxic cycle. But Elizabeth's legacy had given him a way out, a chance to step away from the bitterness that had poisoned his life for so long. One evening, as he was closing up at the foundation, Robert found himself standing before a wall of plaques, each bearing the name of a donor or a family Elizabeth had helped. Among them was a plaque dedicated to her, a simple inscription that read, "In loving memory of Elizabeth, who saw the good in everyone." He reached out, his fingers tracing the letters of her name, and felt a sense of peace settle over him. Elizabeth's life had been filled with quiet strength, a strength he now understood was rooted in love. And though he had lost her, he knew that her spirit would live on, not just through the foundation, but through every life she had touched. In the weeks that followed, Robert withdrew from his family, severing ties with Catherine and the others who refused to let go of their greed. Instead, he focused his energy on the foundation, channeling his grief into a purpose he felt Elizabeth would have been proud of. He volunteered tirelessly, dedicating himself to the work she had started, finding in each act of kindness a piece of the woman he had loved. The transformation did not go unnoticed. The people at the foundation, once wary of him, began to accept him as part of their community. And in time, Robert found a new family among them, people who valued compassion over wealth, kindness over power. He found himself changed, his heart softened by the very legacy he had once taken for granted. In the end, Elizabeth's last letter had been more than just words on a page. It was a final gift, a chance for Robert to rediscover his humanity, to become a man worthy of her love. And though he could never erase the past, he knew that he could honor her memory by living the way she had taught him, with an open heart and a spirit of kindness. As the years passed, the foundation grew, expanding its reach and touching countless lives. Elizabeth's story became a symbol of hope, a testament to the power of love and forgiveness. And Robert, now an integral part of the organization, carried her memory with him every day, a silent promise to continue the legacy she had left behind. Catherine and the rest of the family faded into obscurity, consumed by their bitterness and resentment. They became a cautionary tale, a reminder of what happens when greed blinds one to the things that truly matter. But Robert's life, once defined by his failures, was now a testament to redemption, a story of a man who had found his way back to the love he'd nearly lost. Elizabeth's foundation flourished, and with each new person it helped, her spirit lived on. Her legacy was one of compassion, of resilience, of an unbreakable love that reached far beyond her own life. And though she was gone, her impact remained, a reminder to all who knew her story that love, in the end, was the only inheritance worth leaving behind. Dear viewers, thank you for watching. If you like this story, please subscribe to our channel to receive more stories every day. Share with us what you think of this story.